Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you all today. I'm Harriet Rogers. I head up Strategic Cyber Threat Intelligence. It is a mouthful for BAE Systems, which is an international defence organisation. Kind of riffing on the theme of looking to the future of cybersecurity and conscious that the next session is going to be about resilience and prioritisation. I really want to kind of set the scene and open up a conversation about how we can not only keep up with, but actually get ahead of ever-changing cyber security landscape. I'm going to talk about the connection between geopolitics and the cyber threat landscape and how strategic threat intelligence can really help us navigate that landscape. I'm very conscious it's been quite a long stint of being talked at. So what I'm going to try and do is gallop through the slides a little bit and then have an opportunity for questions and a bit of a dialogue at the end. Okay, I can see the timer, that's a relief. So I think just thinking about strategic threat intelligence more generally, the world is increasingly complex right now. I think recent events show us all of that. We've got geopolitical upheaval, and we have socio-technical revolutions and evolutions happening at what feels like an ever-increasing pace. And I'd like just to invite you all right now to take a moment, cast your mind back to 5 years, to November 2019, go see yourself then, and think about what your assumptions about the future of, the next few years look like for you as an individual, your organisation. So just kind of try and cast your mind back 5 years. And then reflect back that since that time where you're sat November 2019 in a coffee shop or whatever, we've had a global COVID-19 pandemic that has transformed working practices. It's led to a rapid deployment, evolution and development of various technologies that were thought to be years in the future, far, far off, and they suddenly, within weeks, months, became the norm. It's also had huge social and economic shocks that we are still feeling the repercussions of today. We've had a rapid decline in relations between China and the West that completely threatens to completely rewrite the whole world order. We've had a major land war in Europe that is dragging countries from around the globe into. We've had the development of large language models, and I promise to minimize reference to AI in this talk. It's not an AI chat. We've got a major conflict in the Middle East that's threatening to sort of spark an entire regional conflagration. So 2019 you didn't see any of that coming, but all of these factors, issues, events have influenced the cyber threat landscape. Not only have they influenced it, they've actively shaped it and driven it. And that's the landscape which when we are all operating, working, playing, socializing. So that's kind of the background context. So when we think about cyber threats, we're really used to dividing them into pretty neat little categories with equally neat assumptions about who they are and what their objectives are. We think about state actors. Obviously, they're interested in espionage. They're going to try and steal our state secrets. We have our criminals. They're going to use social engineering or something like ransomware for financial gain. And then we have activists who are interested in probably quite low sophistication operations, website defacement, DDoS attacks, hack and leak operations, in order to further their own political or issue messaging. The reality is far, far more complex than that. So nation-state APTs may well be interested in espionage, stealing state secrets, and sowing disinformation, causing mayhem. And as other speakers have alluded to, we've seen a lot of that in the last few weeks in the run-up to the US election, but also the Moldovan elections. But equally, they could be targeting leading technology providers or intellectual property for economic gain to support their strategic objectives. They also leverage other threat actors in order to cause societal harms or disruption within other states that they perceive to be their adversaries. For reasons of deniability or simply of resource, leveraging other groups makes real sense for state actors. They often outsource their operations to hacktivists or criminal groups, or even commercial groups now, with varying degrees of direction, coordination, and encouragement. Again, your hacktivist might be a politically motivated actor who uses low sophistication techniques, but equally, they could be working on behalf of, or even a deniable front for, a nation-state agency, so intelligence agencies or military agencies. Similarly, our criminal organisations are using cyber proliferation, which is a phenomenon whereby certain tools and capabilities trickle down through a kind of ecosystem. So a tooling set may be developed by a tier 1 cyber state actor that then may fall into the hands or be passed on to a tier 2 nation state actor who don't have the capability to develop that sort of tool set organically. That then ends up with organised crime who use it for financial gain, and eventually it ends up as a commercial off-the-shelf capability available to any criminal group who wants to pay for it, which is where we see things like ransomware as a service coming into play. Now, the price of immunity in their host countries for a lot of these criminal organisations is often a degree of government compliance, a degree of government cooperation. After all, if you are a government, going back to those state actors, why would you burn a precious zero-day or waste precious new malware or wiperware when you can just use ransomware to achieve a similar disruptive effect and do it through a criminal organisation and therefore achieve all of the deniability you want to? We also see in the threat landscape a considerable overlap of personnel and infrastructure. So there are companies that will provide an infrastructure. It will be leasable to criminals. It will be used by state agencies like botnets, obfuscation networks, tooling, and we'll also see in some instances an overlap of personnel. So certain actors are observed doing state activity during the day and then more freelance activities outside of working hours. Similarly, some of the hacktivist groups are actually more brokers that specialise in targeting specific industries and then selling on the access or data to interested parties, often nation-state actors. So what we have is a life cycle of capabilities, and that's filtering down through what is a very complex ecosystem of nation-state agencies, criminal organisations, hacktivists, individuals and private companies offering these things as a service, which is actually causing individual, organisational and societal harms to all of us, every one of us in this room. So how do we even begin to navigate that messy environment, let alone get ahead of the game? So embracing strategic threat intelligence goes a real long way to meeting that challenge. We have a tsunami of information that's coming at us all of the time. We can't do everything. We can't be everywhere all at once. So we naturally tend to look to cyber threat intelligence to help us sift through that huge onslaught of information and hunt out what is actually relevant to us. So this is a fairly traditional model that we see here. And at the tactical level, we use technical data. It helps us to understand cyber events as they occur. It helps us support triage, escalation of alerts and attacks, and understand how an attack is likely to evolve in order to support remediation and recovery. Tactical threat intelligence deals with the here and now, the resolution of a specific identified threat, and doesn't really deal with those abstract potential risks that we might be facing. Then onto the operational level, more aimed at security management, help us understand our vulnerabilities, identify weaknesses, and protect future attacks, and enable more effective recovery and incident response. Often, at organisational level, we stop here. But that looks at the how we are doing cybersecurity. It looks at how we are responding. And it misses the complexity of that wider threat landscape I alluded to at the beginning. Strategic threat intelligence is really focused on understanding who is trying to attack us, why they're trying to attack us, and the so what's for our organisation. It is inherently high level in outlook, although not exclusively high level, because it's looking at that complex global environment and considering how our organisation sits within it. It can focus on issues such as geopolitical situations, cyber threat attack trends within certain industries, or how and why certain of our strategic assets might be targeted. It's aimed at a much broader audience than just security teams. It tends to bring in senior decision makers and people outside of cybersecurity as well. And it helps us align our organisational risk management strategies and activities within the threat landscape. Now, I don't really like this traditional model because it shows strategic threat intelligence as a sort of purely high-level activity that's the sort of pinnacle. But actually, used effectively, it can be sort of used to immerse our security teams, but also our wider organisation in a really rich understanding of that cyber threat landscape, and that then enables us to inform decisions at every single level. This model on the right, I think, is much more holistic. It lends itself to being more collaborative with a constant back and forth between all the levels, and it helps us consider strategic threat intelligence as a sort of wrapper that our cyber operations sit within rather than a sort of peak of a bit of an ivory tower. So we hope to get results, obviously, from anything we do, and in order to effectively operationalise it, it's essential that we are proactive rather than reactive and anticipate change and its impact on organisations. So strategic intelligence allows us to move beyond the technical details of a threat actor's specific activity and helps us understand what motivates that driving activity, what allows us for insight then into potential future targets of interest, and ultimately the defensive mechanisms that we need to put in place to protect against and guard against future attacks. So by answering questions like, so what, why, and what's next, strategic threat intelligence informs business decisions and helps guard us, provides context to those organisational threats. It enables us then to create the right security posture and consider the impact that cyber activities have on our organisational decisions, but also what impact our business decisions will have on the cyber threat landscape and help us to address priority threats. So we can anticipate change and its impacts. We can transition from being reactive to being proactive. We can identify broader trends and understand what's likely to land with us next. And we can support long-term planning, define our security posture, and understand the security impacts of our organisational decisions. So that's all great stuff. We're going to be proactive, we're going to prioritise our resources, but actually achieving that, as always, is harder than it sounds. So what we've got is a really collaborative process. Strategic threat intelligence is, by its nature, very multifaceted. It's therefore harder to kind of ingest the information you need to, and it's also sometimes harder to articulate its value, particularly to a technical audience. That makes operationalization a bit of a challenge, and this is especially true in larger organisations where you might have multiple divisions or even business units and functions within divisions that can operate in a really siloed manner. So really, strong collaboration is absolutely key, and it needs to be across teams to ensure it is both informs, but also is informed by operational and tactical threat intelligence. We need to look beyond the immediate cyber security operations teams and identify quite a broad suite of stakeholders and information gathering activities and sources. So having a look at what the sort of day-to-day engagement might look like, we obviously work very closely with the Security Operations Centre, that's a no-brainer, senior leadership teams, end users and ingesters of intelligence projects. Industry partners is a really important one. This is not about getting one over on your competitors. It's about sharing information about the threats that impact everyone. That's absolutely key to this, and getting those trusted relationships going. Requests for information, both into the threat intelligence team, but also coming from us into various areas of the business, what they're up to, what they're looking at. Really, really working hand in glove with risk teams. All of our risk now is threat-led. Really looking at the supply chain as our networks become more and more secure. The attackers are being squeezed out to the edges, so we're seeing that real shift left towards supply chains. Ingestion of open source threat intelligence, really close working partnerships with physical security teams. We're looking at a lot of full spectrum threat actors at the moment, specifically in the nation state sort of adversary field. And whilst we might think in terms of cyber and physical security, our adversaries certainly do not, and they're looking at what effects can they have, and they'll pull any levers at their disposal to achieve those. A lot of horizon scanning activity as well, really trying to look out 5 years, 10 years into the future and understand where that intersection of geopolitics, our organisation and technology sits, what that means. So the traditional intelligence cycle is quite discrete. It doesn't really suit this process brilliantly because it asks a question, answers the question, feeds feedback on the question, and then what next? If you think about it in terms of wrapping direction and feedback in a constant dialogue, then you have a kind of emerging living picture of your cyber threat landscape that you can really immerse yourself in. And I think that's very important, rather than asking, what's the threat now, what's the threat now, what's the threat now? It's kind of building an almost 3D world you can live in. So how do we do it? There's a variety of activities and outputs we use to enable this. I think what's interesting is you would expect with something strategic in the title to be purely focused on the long-term slow burn activities, but in fact that is not the case. Everything we do is clearly focused on either supporting business stakeholders, sharing information with other security stakeholders to strengthen our posture, or informing leaderships to enable them to shape their business decisions. And you might be surprised to see how much of this activity is actually fairly high turnover rather than slow burn. So annually, a strategic threat landscape report that baselines our security situation for the coming 12 months, and a selection of regional or area-specific threat landscape reports as well. So looking at things like operational technology, supply chain threats, specific nation-state threat actors, and things like the Asia-Pacific region or the Middle East. 6 monthly, do deep dive reports that might be into something like, I'm going to say AI again, so adoption of open source AI models into manufacturing, for example, or collaborative risks with higher education research institutes. So regular deep dive reports or case studies into previous high-profile cyber attacks. Quarterly, joint quarterly threat review with the security team that helps then inform all of the different business units in submitting their risks to the board. Security council briefings and inputs into the cybersecurity steering committee that actually shapes our cyber policies. We have monthly cyber threat working groups. They feed into, they are a discussion forum. They are a threat briefing forum, but that's also where the governance and the assurance of the whole process takes place. And that then feeds into security operations working groups and risk working groups and incident response and recovery working groups. And there is also the provision of a executive dashboard, which is what briefs the board on current geopolitical threat actor and business activities and where they overlap and where the really high profile threats sit. That's all the long-term steady state stuff. But then we also have a regular rhythm, battle rhythm of fortnightly, weekly, daily events. So fortnightly joint security briefs on specific topics of interest or items of newsworthy interest to inform security professionals, but also the wider business users about current threat, trying to keep people engaged. We have weekly engagement with the physical security team, supply chain, the cyber risk team, daily conversations with the Security Operations Centre and review of open source threat intelligence and reporting. And then as required, special support to specific programs, in-depth country threat analysis, and support to the education and awareness and training teams. So although strategic threat intelligence is looking at the really big picture and how we fit in the threat environment, it's actually able to support both short and long-term activities. And what I want to sort of finish up on, so I've got a little bit of time for questions, is some examples of how we use them to actually deliver results on a typical basis. So here are 3 practical scenarios: a quite dynamic situation, a more of a medium-term situation, than a long-term challenge, and how strategic threat intelligence can help it. So you might have a dynamic threat situation. There is a mergers and acquisition, a new company that has been brought on board. There's a pre-identified threat to that merger and acquisition. However, its integration into our security posture may take some time, and we know that it's a target of interest to a specific threat actor. So in that instance, we engage the stakeholders early, we do network configuration appraisal, vulnerability surveys, and make sure that that organisation is very well aware of what the threat is. Then when the rapid change in threats happens, there's an escalation in the level of threat from high threat to very high threat. The protective measures are already in place and ready to be rolled out, and additional defences can be activated at the drop of the hat. And that then means that an incident that might have affected one of your competitors in a similar situation doesn't then land on you, because we've already been through that process, we've anticipated it, we've known who is going to target that under what circumstances. When those circumstances come to pass, we're good to go. Another sort of slower burn, ongoing threat situation might be surrounding an in-country threat assessment. Business development might have an overseas footprint in a fairly highly contested cyber environment where critical technologies are being developed, shared. So the in-country activity report will be shared with us, and then we will conduct a cyber and physical security risk assessment. We'll get the teams engaged, might go out to visit that particular location on the ground if that's possible. And then we have an enhanced cyber risk assessment process, which is triggered. Country threat profile and cyber threat landscape analysis is done. We get the technical teams out to do an analysis of the infrastructure in that environment, and then we can actually make recommendations as to what systems can be deployed there and put mitigation in place if that's what's required. And then finally, like a longer term threat is a supply chain example, whereby you might have, during that wider engagement process that we talked about earlier, a critical supplier may have, for example, been taken over by what's considered to be a hostile foreign actor. So that then gets raised with one of the forums, probably the Cyber Threat Working Group. The affected sectors and the supply chain security team are notified, and then we can go through the supply chain threat evaluation process, which is another process that we can stand up. We can do an initial impact and risk assessment to understand whether it's an immediate threat or whether it's something that can be managed. And then from there, you can then continue to do continual assessment and review, and we are able to understand, again, what the future impact might be and what our future impacts actions might be if the situation deteriorates or escalates. I do have a few minutes left. I didn't want to talk at you for too long, possibly talked at you for longer than I should have done. Does anybody have any questions on any of that or comments?
I have a question then.
Oh, okay.
I'll answer one. What's the threat change as a result of Donald Trump being president again? Have you evaluated that?
That is my homework for this week.
Crack on then.
Yeah, no, I think very much for European, thinking in totally geopolitical terms, I think autocracy is going to be emboldened. My main concerns would be around security and Ukraine and security in the Middle East and what that means for European security more broadly. However, I am optimistic that actually a lot of the narrative and dialogue that was talked about during the election campaign actually won't come to pass, and there might be some more measured responses than were forecast. Yes, please.
Why, I mean, it's maybe stupid, why are state actors much more effective or more dangerous than criminals?
Well,
What do they do to become better at it?
it's resource. It's a question of resource. From a criminal perspective, your interest is presumably money. Therefore, there's a kind of cost-benefit analysis to be done at attacking a hardened target. Whereas if you are a state actor, you're not necessarily motivated by quick wins. You're motivated by things that are really going to shift the needle in terms of a conflict or like geostrategic competition. So what is valuable to you is not necessarily what's valuable to a criminal. So if you're a tough target for a criminal, they'll just move on because they're not necessarily that sophisticated. The really sophisticated tool sets sit with the tier one nations.
That was my point, that you talk about sophisticated tool ones.
Yeah. Yeah.
They develop them and criminals can't.
The criminals wouldn't invest in them because there are easier ways of cracking that particular nut if you're just out for cash. With a massive caveat that nation-state threat actors do use criminal organisations to do some of their dirty work, and there are criminal organisations that will be very aware that if they get network access to a certain environment, they will probably get more money from selling that access on than they would from, for example, a ransomware attempt. So it's very complex and murky. It's very deeply intertwined. Oh, have we got time? Yes, got 3 minutes.
A quick one,
The microphone
scenario.
coming.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Hi. The scenarios that you showed up
Yeah.
within your organisation, are they real scenarios that you've actually dealt with and drew the plans from? Or any
Yeah,
of them?
they're the sort of thing that we would see on a fairly routine basis. Yeah, that's kind of bread and butter for a large enterprise. Those are sort of typical scenarios. So we often have a lot of ongoing in-country risk analysis going on. We by default acquire quite a lot of very advanced technology companies that are often quite small and need a good solid security wrap around them. And then supply chain is just vast. It's this huge sprawling beast, and your tier one suppliers are really easy to manage, but their suppliers and their suppliers is quite the challenge. And you do see, again, certain nation states go out of their way to acquire, for example, robotics companies or quite advanced technology companies through fronts. So it's not immediately obvious when a particular organisation has actually been bought out by a particular state conglomerate. It can be through a network of front companies. So it's quite opaque sometimes. So it's a constant, ongoing process. Yeah, welcome.
Time for one more question, I think.
Oh. On the spot.
Thanks. Internal threats, obviously a major concern.
Yes.
I didn't see anything on there, or I may have missed it. Is that part of the strategic plan?
Insider threat, yes. Purely because of the way our model works. Insider threat does tend to fall within the physical protective security domain rather than the cyber domain. I think it's a really great question. That's one of those instances where there's a really close engagement with the cyber and the protective security teams. So things like social engineering, insider threat, that deal specifically with people, but are cyber enabled, tend to fall under the protective security domain with the cyber flavour. Obviously, if we have there are certain triggers for certain insider threat things, and at that point the SOC are made aware, and obviously if somebody starts moving huge volumes of data out, that triggers certain things. But yeah, insider threat is something that's constantly that and social engineering, we see so many, as I'm sure you all do, social engineering approaches, attempts, lures, very well crafted spearfishing attempts. But yeah, that's absolutely on the radar.
Thank you, Harriet.
Thank you very much, everyone.